You're listening to Data Center Therapy. Please take a number, and an engineer will be right with you.
Hello, everybody, and welcome back to Data Center Therapy. I am your host, Matt Yeti, and we have yet another host mix-up here. Well, I'll just say I'm remotely joined by my good friend and co-host, Mr. Matt Cozzolino. Matt, how are you?
I'm wonderful. How are you guys?
Doing all right, and you said you guys, so, I buried the lead. You spoiled it. We've got, and I have him personally here, all the way from Kent.
Yeah,
David Crow. David, how are you?
very good. Thanks for having me.
This is your first time on the podcast, right?
It is indeed.
All right, so you got to do the intro. Let's see some Barry Horowitz style backslapping. Tell us all about yourself. Don't be shy.
Don't be shy. All right. So, my name's David Crow. I've been working at Ivoxy Consulting for about the last 5 years, specializing in end-user compute, specifically VMware Horizon. And, I've been pretty focused on that and been working with that technology for, coming up on 10 years now. So I've seen it go through a lot of developments and, then just general storage, VMware, all that good stuff. A lot of what's in Ivoxy's wheelhouse.
Yeah, it's really good to have you on the podcast. We've been talking about this for quite a while. We want to talk about more EUC and VDI.
Yeah, I figure a couple of those are upcoming, but maybe we could wait until after VMworld and see if they drop anything interesting for us to talk about. I sure hope so, because it feels like it's been a while since a big VDI bombshell of like something
Right.
into the fold.
Most of it is centered around keeping up with Windows releases and compatibility.
Right. Yeah, that's where most of the new stuff is.
Well, at Ivoxy, we're not necessarily known for our strong opinions, right? But we've got us three are three of the more opinionated folks, I think, at Ivoxy, at least on the engineering side.
Yep.
Yeah, so we decided that we'd talk about one of those hot topics that kind of everybody's out there talking about. And we're not talking about the cloud. And no, Mr. Cozzolino, not containers, not today.
Everything's a cloud. Everything's a cloud container, though.
I got one for you, folks. HCI, Hyper-Converged Infrastructure. Anybody wincing? Anybody excited? Are we happy?
I'm only wincing on the inside.
Okay.
I think I'm kind
Yeah.
of looking forward to this. I think this will be a fun one. HCI is going to be a good one.
I am, as forceful as I may be with my opinions, I like to think at least I do have an open mind. I'm willing to have my mind changed, learn new things, of course. Just because I may be forceful with my argument points doesn't mean I'm unwilling to listen to counterpoints. So I am also looking forward to what comes out of this and see maybe I have a different point of view going forward.
Yeah, I don't know. Maybe you come out of this and you'll just love everything about hyperconverged, and we just won't be able to stop you from going out there and telling customers about
We'll
it.
change Yeti's mind, and he's going to be our foremost cheerleader.
Have you seen that? It's a meme going around now, but I think it's a podcast. So Steven Crowder, and he's got the coffee mug, and
I got to change my mind.
Yeah, he's
Then
on a college
people
campus.
Photoshop ridiculous things
Yeah,
onto the sign.
change my mind.
The sky is green. Change my mind. Yeah.
Yeah. Well, I think now the cat's out of the bag. I, in general, am not a great fan of hyper-converged infrastructure. So let's for those listening, you might know what hyper-converged is, but let's just make sure that that everybody understands how we understand it as well. So we're all talking on the same page. For me, and you guys can correct me or put your own input in. For me, hyper-converged infrastructure is the notion of compute, memory, and storage on the same node. The scale-out infrastructure. So I'm not talking about a specific vendor, but hyper-converged is that paradigm where we're not talking about a storage array and ESXi servers connected with 10 or 40 gig switching. It is all in one. Obviously, we'll still have the switching for northbound traffic, but overall, you buy nodes at a time. It has compute, has memory, it has storage in it.
Well, let's get this out of the way too. Are storage nodes cheating? for HCI?
Dedicated storage nodes?
A dedicated storage node. Is that cheating to get around the fact that you don't scale correctly for the application?
Does a storage node have CPU and memory in it?
I think they'll always have some. Now,
Right.
Is it enough to do anything more than serve up the storage?
It's not cheating, but I think it comes with its own pitfalls. So I would say that that's included. We'll talk about
I think
that.
that solves a unique case for HCI that HCI doesn't directly solve, right? So you can go,
Elaborate.
yeah, well, you can have your HCI nodes, right? You've got 10, 20 nodes in your HCI environment, and if you've got a hotspot where you do need extra disk for whatever reason, then maybe add a storage node. But I don't think that's I think that's
Funny.
that weird edge case in the HCI
Well,
deployment.
That's
I don't
funny
think that's
that
what
you
it
use
should
the
be.
term hotspot, because I think you can design yourself into a problem
Yeah.
where you've got, just like, think of an ESXi host where you have 4 guys that all have the same configuration. You bring in a 5th host that is 4 times the resources.
Mhm.
Yep.
Well, your cluster is now unbalanced from a resource. I think you can run into the same kind of situation with HCI in that particular configuration.
I think it'd be challenging if you find yourself out there going, I started with this particular node size and I built up 10 of them.
Right.
And then I wanted to incorporate some SQL workloads. And then there were other things that were more appropriate for that.
Mhm.
Am I building just a completely different dedicated HCI cluster for it?
Mhm.
Now, SQL's kind of a bad example because I think everybody can agree that's
Not a great
not a
use case.
wonderful thing to
Right.
put on HCI. But
Well, I figured one of you two would hit me over the head with how wonderful it is, and I kind of feel like I have to play a little devil's advocate and
So-
come up with what I'm hearing at least.
So let me give you a use case that I like for HCI. And for me, I split up the, like you said SQL, right? SQL isn't the best because it's got this weird large workload. If we go commodity VMs, and I have a machine with 20 gigs of memory or 20 gigs of storage and a couple of CPUs and a couple of VMs, a couple of gigs of RAM, and that's the majority of my environment. So VDI is a great example, or just all of the generic workloads. I think it's great for that. With the edge case being I need special storage for this bigger, larger, more unique, more dedicated thing, like SQL.
Well, I think VDI is a great use case for it. I mean, it's the closest you get to being exactly what HCI handles well, which is a lot of small workloads
Mhm.
with kind of some random sporadic I/O. That seems to work out quite well. It's still a question for me as I'm talking to customers and I'm trying to find the best thing for them. Challenge that I always run into with HCI is maybe I could do that same thing with VDI, but I could build it cheaper with something else, right?
Right.
And the promise of simplicity isn't quite there. Now, here's what I like. Here's what I do like about VDI on Hyperconverged. You don't have to share. You've got all that storage and it's yours, and you don't have somebody else from another team saying, ooh, we could save a few bucks if we also, threw this onto that array, right? Which happens. It's a political issue, and it's not really a technical problem with any of the technology. But if you throw, just to pick on NetApp as a very versatile storage array, you throw a NetApp somewhere, people may want to actually use it for more than its designed purpose, and then you can have performance issues. You didn't size properly for it. HCI is really good at saying, no, it's mine. I've got it for just this. These are the VMs that run. This is what uses it. And you can size it appropriately. You don't have to worry about sharing.
Yeah, you touched on it, David. That's a really good example. You talked about simplicity. You talked about cost.
Yeah.
I would say a lot of the reason for HCI that's being sold out there, being pushed, is it's simpler. Single pane of glass. Don't worry about having a SAN administrator anymore.
Right.
And I would counter that with, we've seen the storage market move drastically simpler.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, a lot of these storage platforms are less of a SAN. I mean,
They're
strictly
almost
from-
plug and play.
They're appliances.
Yeah.
Right. And so I would argue, that may have been true at the very early onset introduction of HCI. That
Yeah.
there was this learning curve gap where, hey, you don't have to worry about storage
Yeah.
anymore. It's great.
Well, think about time to market too, right? These guys were coming up with these ideas for HCI back when,
Right.
it was a problem.
Yeah.
It was a real challenge. And then the storage market over the last 5 years
Yep.
has really evolved into, we're just going to make these as dirt simple as possible,
Yep.
right? Just bulletproof and simple.
Right. So okay. So let's take the manageability. I consider the simplicity argument a losing argument for HCI. I do.
Sure.
There are some people who still want to look at their environment holistically and say, I don't want to go here for my compute and here for my storage. And for that, if that's the case, then yes, HCI has a green checkbox.
Yeah.
Whether or not that's simpler is up to the beholder. So I can't argue there.
Yeah, I think the cost over time too is not necessarily that it's lower, but the way that it's spread out can be attractive to certain businesses.
Yep.
In the sense that I add 1 or 2 nodes a year as I grow, And it's not all of a sudden my $250,000 storage array is end of life, and now I need to replace that for an
But
extra.
A lot of the newer players in the storage game also counter that with the predictable support costs.
Yeah, absolutely. Not all of them, unfortunately.
Not all
of them.
It's a, you know.
Not all of them. So yeah, so that's another thing. It's not cheaper.
No.
It's so you've got, is it cheaper? Is it easier? Well, those are
I think it's
even if
solving
the
a
answer is not
scale
definitively
problem.
no.
I think it's solving
Well-
a scale problem for us. Because you look at a larger environment, and a lot of our customers have the 4, 5, 6 VMs, maybe 10, 20, right? And if you've got racks and racks of VMs, and you've got a
You're
single,
talking VMs or ESXi hosts?
ESXi hosts. If you've
I
got
was going to say
racks
those
and
are
racks
quite
of,
small customers in the VMs.
racks and racks of hosts, and single storage array serving this rack of hosts, or a single storage array serving this other rack, right? That's a whole lot of dedicated hardware for one piece. And that makes a DR play, that makes a stretch data center thing a little more complicated, right?
I don't know if it's more complicated, but just different. I would argue that if I have to scale out across all of that, like you said, 20, 30 hosts, etc., I might be buying storage I don't need. I think with HCI, you have to, because of the resiliency factor and the requirements, you can't rely on RAID anymore. So you are burning an awful lot of disk
But
just
disk
by.
is so cheap.
It's not when you're coming all flash anymore.
Yeah. And with HCI, it gets, I mean, it's not like you're buying the hard drives. It's all hidden. I don't want to get too much into costs and stuff like that, but you only see a couple line items on that bill, and you have no idea what they're charging you for that hard drive.
Mm-hmm.
It depends on the vendor a little bit, but
And enterprise hard drives. We're not talking about popping down to Fry's for a 2 terabyte
Right.
drive because yes, it's
But
cheap.
that's no different than the hard drives we need in a SAN array.
That's true. But I feel like with a SAN, a traditional, I guess, with traditional storage array is what we're talking about. You're able to use all of that storage. Sure, they have data protection methods themselves, but I almost feel like that's inherently built in. But as you scale, I just feel like you use more of it from a traditional standpoint.
well, I see that as a big problem for VDI specifically because of all the technologies around, linked clones and now instant clones. And dedupe, and you're running 1,000 Windows 10 VMs that have very little on them, but the actual operating system itself. So your dedupe rates are just off the charts. And so no matter how small of a node you're adding from a hyperconverged standpoint, adding an extra, let's say 60 to 100 VMs, depending on how they're sized, is not going to eat up all that storage.
Right. So you're basically going to be adding nodes strictly for the compute.
Yep.
Here comes the storage I have absolutely no use for the most part.
Right.
Outside of I/O.
Yeah, and different HCI vendors are going to have different sizings,
Mhm.
and one may be able to get closer than the other, but I think you're always going to have a little of that. That being said, I'm talking very perfect world here, and in reality, my customers, to some extent, almost always have a certain percentage of their workloads are still running on persistent desktops, and sometimes that percentage is high. Just I don't want to get too much into the end user compute specifically, but all of the profile management and application layering and all that stuff is a ton of work. And I've seen a lot of customers just go, it's easier to throw storage at it. I'm just going to deal with the persistent desktops and
And so
be good with that.
So are you saying that you get more storage than you need, and you can't use it all even using persistent desktops, or are you saying?
I think if you use persistent desktops, that problem goes away to some extent because those are going to sprawl. They're not going to dedupe as well.
And so your main argument is that when you're scaling out HCI nodes, you're ending up with more capacity, more disk capacity than you actually need because of the way it has to scale.
And because of how well non-persistent workloads in VDI, how little storage they use, right? A linked clone uses practically no storage. You get one copy of it on the data store, on each host. And then to build a new one it's kilobytes until somebody logs in and it downloads their profile and they start changing things and then it gets blown away again. So it's very storage efficient. So yeah, I think no matter what sizing you do, if you're running all non-persistent, you end up, hey, I was using 60% of my storage when I had 4 nodes, and now that I've got 8 nodes, I'm using 40%.
So
50%.
if we change that argument and you said to scale out a host, you add this memory, add this CPU, add this disk, which results in each host now has enough compute and memory and storage to be able to run any portion of that workload, regardless of the extra overhead. Now we've given ourselves a off into the distance a number of hosts we can build into an environment without having to worry about sizing our storage array correctly from day one.
That's true, but storage array expandability is also not a hardship. I don't think. I
That's
still think
true.
that is it's this is my thing, and to get really 30,000 foot level.
Hmm.
So much of our industry that I'm frustrated with is you're selling me this because it's different, not because it's necessarily better, because it's different, and the paradigm shifts and it's a different way of looking at it, and yet I still come out to the same outcome, and maybe it's just within a few bucks, or it's more, or it's way more expensive. I don't care. Like, good for you. You did it a different way. Net result is the same. I'm not impressed, I guess, and I'm still waiting for somebody to tell me, like, hey Matt, and I keep going back to it. Here's vMotion.
Hmm.
Well, so here I think there's an element of it at least that is all down to, you know, we're not going to name any names, but it's all down to the marketing. It's all down to the sales strategies, and I feel like there is a C-level down marketing strategy with the HCI. If you get the engineer in the room, he may not be quite as thrilled about the whole thing. But if you're talking to a C-level, and then you start saying, you know, buzzwords like private cloud and stuff like that, and then he gets to buy the HCI, put on his resume, he's got an extra bullet point on there that says spearheaded the corporation's private cloud initiative,
Consolidation of infrastructure.
yeah, and then he makes an extra 40,000 next year when he jumps ship to somewhere else.
And that's true. And from an executive standpoint, and I'm not a manager, I'm not an executive, I don't want to be, but I can see the idea of a hyper converged infrastructure. It's less moving parts. It's a simpler mechanism. It's better. I can understand why that's an easy sell. I think you're right. I think it's targeted from C down.
Yeah, and there's that there. You say there's no value in doing it differently, but I think from a, I don't know, from a C-level who's looking to make his mark on an organization, to say that I changed something and it was a good change.
Yes.
I think that there's, you know, something to be said for that, for them specifically, not the technology.
Yeah, I'll buy that. I mean, that's one of the ones we look at is, you know, what problem are we solving whenever we recommend a solution, right?
Yeah.
So unless there's a problem to solve, and I think, I don't know, the scale is where I see the HCI being an actual fit. Other than that, I think you're right. We can get a better solution for most of our customers with some number of ESX hosts and some sized storage array, because they aren't going to quadruple in size in 6 months, kind of a thing.
Well, I'm also a skeptic in terms of the source of the marketing, in terms of, okay, who benefits, cui bono, right? In terms of hyperconverged, I see right now a lot of storage vendors getting into the HCI game. And it almost feels like, hey, compute vendor, you're going after my storage revenue. I'm going to go after your compute revenue, so they don't give you that. And so I'm white box vendor A who sells servers and desktops out the wazoo. I want a little taste of that storage money. And now storage says, oh yeah, well, I'm going to start selling x86 servers and bolt it onto my storage technology, so I can get that piece of that pie too. So does the consumer win in that? If it ends up in a better, more competitive, efficient product,
Yeah.
if it's
It
just
ends up
here,
being a better product at a good price, then yeah, the consumer wins. But if it's just a bunch of posturing and back and forth and trying to move
Right.
money around, then
right?
good chance not.
I will say, and I don't know if I am on board subscribing to this opinion, but I have heard it. Single phone number to call. Have you, gents, talked to any customers who have had a better experience calling hyperconverged vendor A, and then when needing storage or VMware help? Because to be honest, I like discrete troubleshooting ability. I like to be able to look
Yeah.
at my storage and either say, yeah, there's an issue, or nope, that's good. Let me move on to the next piece. Where HCI is a bit of a black box.
Yeah, I find that's a big selling point. You know, the one throat to choke, if you will. But I don't find that in practicality that it actually ends up making a big difference for the customer, because generally, you know, generally you've got your compute stack, whatever it is, right? You have a problem with it. You know it's a problem with the compute, and you call the manufacturer, and you can very often still have a horrible support experience. That doesn't make the support experience intrinsically good, because I don't find, and maybe your guys' experience is different than mine, I don't find a whole lot of customers who are calling up a storage vendor because it really looks like a storage problem, and the storage vendor just goes, "That's your network."
Right.
It's a really interesting fake conversation to have to try to sell the one phone number support. But I don't find that support is that irresponsible most of the time to just say, no, definitely not us. I mean, I think for the most part, they'll dig into the issue. Now, maybe
Well,
you
I
were
think-
wrong, and maybe they can't find it.
Well, I think a benefit of HCI, if it is as sold, and I had a customer recently who had a storage array from one of our partners and a VMware environment, obviously, and there was a question of performance or something going on, and storage array vendor said, open up a ticket with VMware so we can work together with them, and they did, and that works. But the customer did ask me, why did I have to go to VMware and open up a ticket? How come this storage vendor couldn't just? Don't they have VMware guys there? Don't they have?
Hmm.
And I understand the question because they live so close to the metal on a day-to-day basis. You would hope, but that would be one. I'm not saying hyperconvergence is a solution there, but that is certainly an argument point that they're going to use. And
Sure.
and that, hey, you had to go call VMware, open a ticket, and push it that way, and hope that they work together. And then what they have to babysit that.
I feel like I'm kind of with David on that. That's a hard sell for me because I feel like a lot of the times the benefit and what has to happen is you have to go to support with a good break fix. I'm trying to do X and this is broken and I expect Y, and this is the thing that's happening, right? If you can present someone with that, that's what I try to do anytime I call support. Is here's the thing, here's the broken thing. I try to do X and this is not the result I get, right?
Yep.
So if
Yep.
you can do that,
And we're ops guys right at heart,
Right,
and
right.
we are also do-it-yourselfers too, because
Yeah.
we all came from operations,
Yeah.
and we're used to doing things ourselves. Listen, I think I was a NetApp customer before I was an
Mhm.
iBoxy
Yep.
employee.
Mhm.
I believe I opened 60-something tickets. I figured when I became an iBoxy employee and thus a NetApp partner, somebody at NetApp said, "Oh boy, Yeti's this guy is now we're on the same side." Like my picture's on a wall somewhere there. I'm sure of it in support. Anyway, the canceled
same
checks
way,
do not
yeah.
cash from these people.
Mhm.
Do not take. But I like not having to necessarily rely on this magic phone number to troubleshoot. Where I almost feel like HCI, it is a
black box.
It is a black
Yeah.
box. I feel like that, and I would rather dig in and make sure my storage is healthy instead of just trusting that it is taking care of it. And I might be different than some customers in that. Admittedly, that might.
Yeah, that's
Mhm.
fair. There's a market for set it and then make it somebody else's problem.
Right.
I mean,
True,
the cloud is in large part taken off entirely based on now it's not my problem.
Yeah, but are all of your users calling up Microsoft Azure when services go down? No, they're choking you, and you're like,
Still,
hey,
yeah.
what do you want from me?
Right.
So going back to Matt Cozzolino, you had an interesting point about scalability with hyperconvergent. Move back into that a little bit. What I find is, and this may or may not be a reasonable selling point for it, but what I find when I look through customers' VDI environments, looking through one recently, they have hundreds of data stores by the time they build this thing out, right? And I can see the value, because you got app volumes, and you can only do so many attachments per copy of the VMDK, so you got to spread that out across 4 or 5 data stores, and your writable volumes and all these different places and how you segregate these different kinds of machines that you build. And then some customers who have gotten, bad advice about, or old, sometimes it's not bad advice, but it's old and they don't want to go over a certain size or a certain number of VMs on something. So they end up carving things up. And, you're looking at 30, 40, 50 data stores to build a decent sized, and by that I mean several hundred users, VDI environment. And I could see the value of just being able to say, no, it's one data store and I can throw everything on it. I don't have to worry about where my stuff is because I know it's in one spot.
Mhm.
Yep, that's absolutely true. And with like you say, that to me smacks of legacy. It exists. I would counter that with most modern storage vendors. That is not the design, and you can have the one-ish big bucket if you so desire.
But not with VDI. Can't do one big bucket.
Specifically VDI?
Specifically VDI because of the way app volumes works. VMware will not let you do it. And in fact, they only test up to a certain number of application attachments to a single VMDK. So if you drop all your app stacks on a data store and then you have 2,000 people log in and they're each getting 2 or 3 app stacks and you got 7,000 attachments to make, right?
Does that not bear true for an HCI environment?
VMware fully supports you doing all that stuff on vSAN.
Okay.
right?
And
which,
that's
as far as I know, yeah, you don't have a way to break it all out in the same way that you would.
Okay.
Not being a vSAN expert or anything.
that's kind of what I
Interesting.
see in the scalability piece. I can use NSX to get my networking consistent from data center to data center, and I can use my vSAN to get my storage consistent from data center to data center. Then I can put
Yeah.
an entire data center into maintenance mode and swing all of my workload over to the other side without having to do any
Well,
impact, right?
and if you talk about the overall life cycle over time, right? At a certain point, you've got to migrate all this storage off onto something else because the box goes away
Mm-hmm.
at some point. Now, some folks have great automated tools for doing it. I mean, it's not a hardship, but it is another thing that you have to do. Where with HCI, you're going to pull out a few of your old hosts this year, throw in a few new ones, and join it up, right? And it's just going to kind of sit there like a blob.
You abstract that forklift storage replacement.
Right. Which, there's a lot of good ways to do it, and there's a lot of folks who can do it well, and at the same time, it's another thing to do that you don't have to worry about.
So where I'm at is I'm hearing that VDI, and I'm believing that VDI is certainly the most applicable use case. Okay, fine.
Yeah, I'd agree with that.
Let me ask you this, and I truly don't know. And the same, I would say, restriction that I'm worried about here holds true for any blade infrastructure, which not necessarily HCI. GPUs. Is there any restriction, or is it less compatible, flexible with slotting in GPU acceleration into vendor X's HCI?
Now, you have to know what you're doing going into it, right? You have to know, I want to do GPUs the day you start purchasing those nodes, because the most cost-effective nodes are going to be the super micro. We're slamming 4 of these blades into 2U chassis, which all that stuff makes me nervous too, because when the hardware spec change and stuff like that, I mean, there's concerns, but there are a lot of HCI vendors who have 2U servers, and that's really your ticket. You get a 2U server, you can put all your normal stuff in there.
Right, and unfairly, I'm thinking HCI, this 2U server with 4 nodes, right?
Right.
I'm
that
thinking
2U
rack
server
blade.
is still a computer. It's still a regular compute node,
Yeah.
and you have the space to do that. When you get super dense, that's what you're talking about, like the small little,
Yeah,
small
you want to
little
get super dense, you're going to have a problem. And I'm not even sure what you can, if anything, from a GPU standpoint, slam into one of those.
And I would say originally one of the selling points of HCI, I don't know if it still is you don't have the rack space. You've got a small little closet. You don't have 6 rack units. You don't have 8 to 12 rack units for a full-fledged. And I say you can put 4 pizza boxes and an array in 6U.
Well, that's
anyway.
the thing. You're not saving any space with it if you're doing VDI with vGPUs. You're just absolutely not. That being said, I also, nobody has brought up the idea of remote branch offices.
Yeah.
Right. Nobody said that, and I think it's meaningful that nobody said it. Right. So I'm going to say why I think it just doesn't fit as well as folks think that it does. I mean, I've got a couple exceptions in my experience, but that's usually somebody gets cut a screaming deal because then they figure it's going to make its way back into the data center, and they've got a loyal customer. But the issue that I find with it is the resiliency factor and the maintenance on it, right? You got a small branch office and you're trying to do a 3-node or, heaven prevent a 2-node or something like that. The resiliency factor on it, you've got to migrate data off every time you put it into maintenance mode. I mean, it's a big
I'm glad you brought that up. That's one of my things too. Is depending on your design, you don't necessarily need to migrate data to put a host in maintenance mode. But my knee-jerk reaction is, hey, I want to put my host into maintenance mode. I want to patch it. I don't want to wait X number of minutes or hours for all that data to evacuate. I like to separate my compute and my data planes.
Yeah, if you could do like RF3. And there are HCI vendors who will support even on if you want to waste that disk.
There it is. If you want to overbuy your storage,
right? So that's what it is. Is if you're at the smallest, if you're at that minimum, then you have to move that data because it only lives in so many spots. But once you start scaling and you have the compute and you have the capacity available, then put a host into maintenance mode because there's already 3 copies of it.
Right. And yet we find the robo argument, which is going to put you in more of that situation that David talked about.
Yeah, it comes up. And there are, depending on what you're doing, I've seen it be cost effective for customers to do that. And I have one customer in particular I'm thinking of, and he's had good luck with it. Little 2-node setups out there.
Well, as we come to the end of this discussion, I like to kind of put my cap on it by saying, here's where I think HCI works. the vendors who have implemented it into their product. Rubrik and Cohesity, let's say.
Sure.
They are a hyper-converged infrastructure. They scale out. And something like a Rubrik where you add nodes and add capacity and the compute is with it. But
I would argue that
are
a
you-
Rubrik and a Cohesity are two different things. I think you're talking about. I don't see that in a vSAN being anywhere at the same thing.
But they're both hyper-converged technologies under the covers.
What do you mean? I mean,
Their appliances are built upon hyper-converged. They use something like a Cassandra or whatever underneath the covers to scale out linearly. Each node is compute, memory, and storage, and it is hyper-converged. It's not for general-purpose computing, but the appliance itself is built upon HCI, and I would argue that's the way to do it because it's a specialized workload. They have full control of the system. There aren't, and when I say full control, you're not running
They own the
this
hardware
department's
all the way to the
request.
software,
And Department X is not saying, I need this big old blob VM running on here.
So what do you think about the idea of because you brought up full control start to finish? What do we think about the idea of those people just selling the software and you going to Cisco.com and ordering yourself up some generic servers and then loading that on top? You lose that benefit.
That's always made me nervous since the early days of vSAN.
That's like
And we had
buy a Mac versus buy a Windows machine, right?
Yeah. We had a hardware compatibility list issue with vSAN early days, but this 3-4 years ago, and everything we bought was on the hardware compatibility list. Then it came out, that RAID controller is on the list, but you need to have it with the 2 gigs of RAM, not the 1, or else it falls over with any. And I'm like, boy, this would be easier if there was an appliance that was pre-certified. I didn't have to worry about lining up.
And that's the ready node.
Right.
That's the ready node. And so they've kind of addressed that. And,
Yep.
and certainly, if we're talking specifically vSAN, I'll say that the only way I would sell it today is with a ready node, right?
Yes.
And with VDI environments. I mean, I think those
Yes.
that's kind of, I gotta know those two things, that the customer is not going to ask me to piecemeal something together, that it's go right down the middle of the fairway.
Yep.
I want a ready node, and maybe in a VDI environment. But I think there's still the discussion to be had with the customer. And I've had some customers that it's just a preference. They go,
Yep.
I like it.
Yep.
I dig it. Sell me
I
that
want
again.
to be cloud because cloud.
Yeah.
And no other reason.
Just because
Yep.
it is.
Yep.
And, at the end of the day,
Right.
that's
Customer
their choice
choice,
to
yeah.
make.
Do you have any closing arguments, Matt? I feel like I won this battle. I mean, cleanly. Cleanly and clearly. I think the judge cards are really...
I don't feel like this was a battle.
I don't feel like it is either.
But then again, New York, New York.
Thank you very
Yeah,
much.
true that.
No, this was good. I don't think anybody really delivered a knockout blow in one way or the other, but I feel like I've said... I've in my job day to day, things come to mind. I go, I want to discuss that with someone. I feel like every thought I've had about HCI came out today.
There you go.
I
You brought
feel
it
good.
all.
I feel unburdened.
You unburdened
feel
your
better.
lawyer now?
It's like
Yes.
therapy. Yeah.
Yeah, data center. Wow.
Yeah.
Mr. David
So we're
Crow
gonna
in his
charge you for
initial
this time,
appearance,
Eddie.
tying it in. Well, David, thanks for coming all the way up for
Oh,
this
you bet.
episode.
Appreciate
this is great. Matt, thank you for joining
Of
us
course, of
remotely.
course.
It's always good to chat. Thanks for everybody for listening. If you've got other topics you'd like us to talk about, hit us up at podcast@ivoxy.com. You can reach us at datacentertherapy.com. I just realized that forwards to our Ivoxy site, so good job by Dustin. I mean, they've been really pushing out
Marketing,
there.
very good.
Market's doing their thing.
Again, so yeah, reach out to us. Reach out if you have any questions, topics you want to hear about, or just have any questions at all in general, or want more information about how Matt plans to scale out HCI for what was it for?
For
I'm just
big,
kidding.
huge compute nodes, man.
Put him on the spot.
That is so sneaky. Right at the end.
Right
you
at
think
the
it's
end.
over.
Absolutely.
AWS. Build an AWS. Build your private cloud. Do it.
Thanks for listening to Data Center Therapy, everybody. Have a great day.